It's been a while since I've touched on Teal Swan, so let me give you guys a refresher. A while back, I did an interview with a friend of mine named Andy Fellows. He was a member of a group called Teal Swan. We talked about the group's status as a cult, which I'm fairly comfortable confirming. It's a cult, but I got a lot of pushback on that. How can I know it's a cult? I haven't even provided evidence of that. Well, let's do that now. Is it a cult or not? Let's get into it. As I mentioned a minute ago, Andy Fellows is kind of leading the charge against this group, and has been since he exited. He talks about them a lot on his YouTube channel. I put a link to his channel in the description and the pinned comment, so you should give that a look if you're curious about him. I would definitely recommend him. I also put some other links down there to stuff like my merch store and my retro game store, which has all kinds of cool stuff on there. And I put a link to my podcast too, where I talk about things I don't feel I can say on a monetized channel, so check that out too. Okay, with all that being said, let's take a look at Teal Swan. This is a byte model breakdown. For those of you who might be unfamiliar with the byte model, it was written by Stephen Hassan. It's a model we use to determine if something is a cult or not. It's an acronym. It stands for Behavior Control, Information Control, Thought Control, and Emotional Control. BITE. It's the 4 ways that cults control their members. Typically, if you try to control somebody's behavior, they'll reach out in other ways. They'll look for emotional support. If you try to control their emotions by doing things like instilling irrational fears and phobias, or forbidding them from talking to friends or family, or labeling some emotions as sinful or wrong, they'll reach out for information. They might search for information that's critical of the group or leadership. They might talk to ex-members. If you can control people in these 4 ways, behavior, information, thought, and emotions, then they have no way of escaping the situation. So I've created a scorecard style rating system for the byte model to compare groups. I use the Fibonacci sequence to give them a rating on each point, so they can score a 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, or 21. The reason I have it increasing like that is because the more extreme the group gets, the more clear the disparity becomes. I'll put a graphic at the bottom of the screen as we go, so it'll be a little bit easier to understand. Lucky for me, Andy Fellows and some others collaborated to do a full byte model breakdown in written form on his website, which I'll also be linking in the description as a resource. It was invaluable while I went through this information because it has citations and links to videos and blog articles and everything from the leader. It's all compiled in one place, so I have to say thanks to Andy. This was probably one of the easiest breakdowns I've ever had to do. One more thing before we get started on this. I'm only going to hit the major points here for the sake of time. You should definitely go look at the full breakdown on Andy's website, but I wanted to give a little background on the group before we get started so you have some context. The group is run by a woman who calls herself Teal. It's a new age group. It's a lot like spirit science in many ways, which I've talked about on my channel before and intend to in more depth in the future. They've even collaborated with each other, and it's almost entirely online, which is an interesting transition from traditional cults. Historically, control methods have been exerted by having the person there physically. Like with Jehovah's Witnesses, the elders can investigate members and physically see if they're breaking any rules. They can see if they're smoking cigarettes or talking to people who they call apostates. But being an online cult, a lot of the control methods lean heavily on surrounding the member with insider friends, reporting your thoughts, feelings, and activities to them, and encouraging people to spy on others' misconduct. Anyways, let's start with the first category on the byte model: behavior control. Promote dependence and obedience. In traditional cults, this was typically done by crippling the member in some significant way, usually financially, and claiming to have divine authority and access to special information that nobody else has, making them depend on you. So does Teal Swan do this? We'll get into the money part in a minute, but yes, she does. She claims to have access to special information that nobody else has, and you have to be close to her, follow her instructions, read her material, and watch her videos to gain access to that information. But it doesn't stop there. She also uses something she calls shadow work, which heavily plays into it. Since that's also covered in the next point, let's move on to that one. For the record, I'd put the group at about a 13 for this one. Modifying behavior with rewards and punishments. This is one of the cornerstones of maintaining a cult. Let me put it this way. A lot of you guys probably know the story of Pavlov and his dog. He was a psychologist. Every day he would ring a bell and feed his dog. The next day, ring a bell, feed the dog. Ring a bell, feed the dog. And one day he rang the bell but didn't feed the dog, and the dog started salivating. Two completely unconnected events, the sound of a bell ringing and the thought of eating food, are now linked in the mind of the dog. That's what cults do with their members. They modify their behavior with rewards and punishments to turn their personalities into something different, to replace their authentic personalities with the cult personality. So what about Teal Swan? Do they do this? As I mentioned a minute ago, they have this whole program of modifying your behavior they call shadow work. Scientology has something like this too. And of course, Teal sets the goals of shadow work to be what she sees as most beneficial. So they're overtly modifying their members' behavior. I would put this at a 21 on the scale. I'm sure there's some case where behavior modification is more intense than this, but I can't think of a real-world example of it. Next. Dictate where and with whom you live. This one is a good example of ways in which traditional cults differ from online cults. It would be possible to control where and with whom people live, but it's a lot harder to do with an online cult rather than an in-person one. There are a few like this, so I'm going to skip over the ones that have lower scores for the sake of time, but I'll list the scores after each category and give an average of each when we're done. Regulate what and how much you eat and drink. This one is extremely fascinating to me. For those of you who are interested, you should go check out the video linked in the citation on Andy Fellow's Bite Model Breakdown. Citation 6B1. It's an older video from 2012, but she clearly lays out every single thing you should and shouldn't be eating in great detail, and explains that she has special insight on the subject because she can see people's auras. So when they eat this thing or that thing, like sugar for example, she can see their auras change color and knows that people's bodies don't resonate with different foods.
The question that's been selected this week is, what diet can I eat to live the most spiritual life? What you want to be doing is eliminating simple carbohydrates. You want to eliminate sugar. You want to eliminate dairy. You want to eliminate meat and processed foods. Many of you may know that part of my job is to work as a medical intuitive. So when I am asserting this opinion of mine, it is the opinion of somebody who is watching energy in the body. When I'm watching somebody eat something, I can see the way that your energy either resonates or does not resonate with this specific food group. And while all people are different, and so they can deal with foods differently and resonate with different foods. You know, one person might have an easier time digesting meat than another person. In general, the same way that we could speak about all pesticides being bad for a human biological system, we can talk about foods in general being bad or good for a human biological system, and that's the foods that I'm listing here today. So, the worst foods, I'm going to list them from worst to least worst, are as followed. The worst food you can put in your body energetically, in terms of what I'm seeing, are substitute sugars. Things like saccharin, aspartame, and sorbitol. I don't watch people's energy. I've never watched a person's energy, regardless of their body type, agree with alcohol.
I would put them down as a 21 for this one. Next, exploit you financially. Scientology is probably best known for this one. They charge you out the wazoo just to be a member, and if you can't afford it, then you just can't be a member. Mormonism also heavily exploits people financially, but they do it in such a way that anybody can be a member, by requiring you to pay 10% of your income to the church to maintain membership. Teal Swan does it more Scientology style, by charging to take part in retreats. She also at least used to charge for quote-unquote training in her quote-unquote completion process, which cost $2,400. The retreats apparently cost about $5,000, but she got a cease and desist order for practicing therapy without a license for the completion process, not to mention the donations, the merchandise she sells, and all of the other stuff. Now, granted, it's a for-profit business. That's the defense she cites every time when people accuse her of exploiting people financially. But this for-profit business is offering people miracle cures and completely useless products. It's all snake oil. The theology behind it convinces people that the products are actually worth something, and that lets her set her own price, which is usually exorbitant. But I would put them down as a 13 for this one. Scientology is probably worse about it. Here's a scorecard for behavior control. They get an average of 4.2, but they had some 13s and 21s in there, and as far as I'm concerned, any group that scores that high on any 1 point is a cult. But let's continue on and take a look at the other categories. Next is information control. Forbid you from speaking with ex-members and critics. Jehovah's Witnesses call me apostate, Scientology calls me suppressive person, and Teal Swan calls me a hater, a term that relates to their new age, millennial, hippie-like roots. And the reason why I'm a hater is because, and I'm quoting Teal here, I idolize and envy her. I feel inferior, like she's higher up on a pedestal. I don't know that she outright bans members from talking to critics, but it's heavily implied, and it's part of the culture, so I'm giving them an 8. Discourage access to non-cult sources of information. There are lots of examples of this one, which, as aforementioned, can be found in the full breakdown on the website I listed in the description, but in the blog articles and videos cited there, Teal says the media shouldn't be trusted if they say anything negative about her. She discourages people from quote-unquote teacher hopping. She says they need to have loyalty to a specific practice and a specific teacher, i.e. her. She said, quote, "When people watch the news, they seem to think that those news channels reporting those things, or those journalists covering those stories, is some sort of Good Samaritan act. Like sharing the truth is something we do for the good of mankind. What I need you to do is get this idea out of your head. Though there may be journalists who also have some motivation mixed in there to tell the personal truth and think that's super important, I'll explain that later. It's not a Good Samaritan act. These stories and these things are done specifically to drum up good business because media is a business." She's doing something I've noticed other groups doing too. She'll say something that has a grain of truth to it, and she'll use that to add credibility to everything else she says. Like Jehovah's Witnesses saying that hell isn't biblical, or that the Trinity isn't biblical. That's accurate. Hell and the Trinity are not biblical. The Bible was modified later to incorporate those ideas. So when people research this stuff, they find that it's true, and they're more likely to believe the other stuff that Jehovah's Witnesses say. Teal is using the fact that the media is a business and is generally distrusted to break any trust the person might have for a story done on her. Yes, those things are true, and the media often does do things for clicks, but that doesn't mean that literally everything is done specifically to drum up good business, and it certainly doesn't change the fact that Teal Swan is a cult, or the fact cited in the case against her. I'm giving her a 13 on this one. I could put it at 21, and I feel like it might still be a fair assessment, but honestly, I'd rather be overly charitable to the group. If it's a cult, then it'll shine through anyways. Generate and use propaganda extensively. This is a hallmark of a cult. I mean, the company that owns and started the religion of Jehovah's Witnesses, the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, is a printing company. They started out by printing propaganda nonstop. Teal releases videos and blog posts weekly. She's a propaganda mill. I'd give him a 13. Gaslight to make you doubt your own memory. This is an interesting one. Teal Swan has a record of planting false memories in people's minds. False memories are a heavily researched area of psychology. Scientology actually does this too, through what they call auditing. You're supposed to recite every memory you can conjure, all while a Scientologist is writing it down to be sent off to the main office and used against you if you ever become a problem for the group. And when you run out of memories to tell them, they'll have you dig deeper and tell them memories you have from past lives. You come to believe that these things really did happen, even the most absurd stuff. Teal Swan does something similar with false memories, though as far as I know, it isn't recorded and sent to anybody the way Scientology does it. I'd give her an 8 on this one, where Scientology and Heaven's Gate are probably a 21. Again, I'm being extra charitable. Here's the scorecard on information control. Interestingly enough, the average is 6.66. Kind of funny. That's a lot higher than the last one. And again, they had some 13s. That's extremely concerning. Let's continue to thought control. Instill black and white, us versus them, good versus evil thinking. There are a number of ways in which Teal Swan employs black and white thinking, which, again, is a hallmark of a cult personality, but one of the main ways, and one I'll cite here, is how they view apostates to the group. They're evil. They're envious of members' success. I would put them at an 8 for this one. Could be worse, but it's certainly not great. Placing extreme or exaggerated importance on seemingly trivial events or ideas. This one is actually one that I added to the bite model. The example I always cite is how Jehovah's Witnesses refuse to buy certain snow globes or certain types of candy during the holidays because they don't want to support a pagan institution like Christmas. Is it really that important? How much support are you really lending to a quote-unquote pagan institution by buying certain types of candy during a certain time of the year? And what about not celebrating birthdays? One of the reasons Jehovah's Witnesses cite for not celebrating birthdays is the fact that in every biblical mention of birthdays, somebody loses a head, and they call it self-worship. Is it really so important that you would separate yourself from an entire cultural event? No. It's not. It's placing extreme or exaggerated importance on trivial events or ideas. In Teal Swan's case, I was never a member, so it's hard to tell, but I've seen a few things that tip me off and seem really concerning. So since I'm being extra charitable, I'll give them a 3 on this one. Allow only positive thoughts. Now, this is an interesting point for this group. Not only do they do the exact opposite, but they take it to an extreme. One of the core messages is that you have to have authenticity. It leads to people revealing the darker parts of their personalities and being proud of it. They encourage being rude and trolly, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, means the apostates are treated that much worse for leaving or opposing the group. It's similar with Scientology. I'm giving her a 13 on this. Even though it's about having only positive thoughts, she's still controlling the thoughts of the members in a destructive way, so in my mind, it still counts. Reject rational analysis, critical thinking, and doubt. I'd give the group a higher number on this one because they tend to dismiss criticisms or doubt by saying that the doubter just doesn't understand what Teal is trying to teach. If you work harder and throw yourself deeper into it, then you'd understand. I'll give him an 8. Here's their scorecard for thought control. They had an average score of 5, a little better than their last score of 6.66, but they seem to be maxing out the points in most of these categories. That means I'd consider them just as bad as Scientology, Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormonism, or even the Heaven's Gate cult from the 90s in some ways. Let's take a look at the last category, emotional control. Promote feelings of guilt, shame, and unworthiness. I've said this before, but I'm going to say it again. Teal is not a licensed psychologist and has no right to give out psychological advice. Despite that fact, she still encourages people to do her shadow work routine, which leads straight to feelings of guilt, shame, unworthiness, and victimhood. I even mentioned earlier that she believes apostates envy her because of how great she is and want to take that away from her. The entire program leads straight to these types of feelings. I'd peg them at a 13 for this one. Shun you if you disobey or disbelieve. I would say Jehovah's Witnesses and Scientologists are at a 21 for this one. It does not get more extreme than that for this point. Cut them out of your life completely. Teal Swan also discourages contact with apostates, but to a less extreme extent. I would put the group at a 13. Here's the final scorecard for emotional control. They got an average of 7.3. They're the most extreme in this category. If they really wanted to control their members, they'd have to even those scores out a little bit more. They were the lowest on behavior control. That's probably because it's an online cult rather than a traditional one. It's easier to control the other aspects of the member's personality over the internet. Either way, it's extremely concerning to see it growing as fast as it is, and I hope they get more attention than they have right now. They have some really strange beliefs to go along with their destructive control methods, and as I said before, you can learn more about them on Andy Fellow's YouTube channel, so give it a look. Anyways, that's all I've got for you. Thanks for giving this a listen, and don't forget to check out my podcast, my merch store, my Etsy store, and all my social media. Links to all that can be found in the description and the pinned comment, as always. Okay, thanks for watching, guys.